Welcome back to Kelowna Real Estate Podcast. I'm your mortgage broker host, Taylor Atkinson.
And I am the real estate agent host, Matt Glenn. What's happening, Taylor? We had a week off.
Yeah.
I know everyone missed us.
Yeah, we needed to take a bit of a break to get some energy because we got a long list of good guests coming in. So we wanted to prep for that.
Yeah, that's true. We do.
Yeah, actually, our last show was with Scott Beaton, which was an awesome show and, kind of relevant. We had a 2.7 inflation rate come in. So everything's kind of lined up for the summer for some hopefully rate cuts. But yeah, give that a listen if you haven't. He dives into all that data.
We had a ton of feedback on that show. That was a good one.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, he was a great guest to have on. He was dropping knowledge the whole time.
Yeah, to continue with good guests. So today, pretty high profile guest, City Council, Regional Board Chair, Community Advocate, Entrepreneur, Volunteer, Philanthropist.
BC NDP Candidate in the fall election.
Yeah, a lot of the guests we've had on this show, we kind of speak to the other side of that sector.
Like being a Kelowna real estate podcast, like we're in a bit of an echo chamber from all the points of view we hear. Like the short-term rental thing is most of the people we hear for are against the laws, against a lot of the new regulations that have come in. We wanted to get ourselves out of our bubble and talk to the other side. So we have the best guest to talk to about that, and that is Loyal Wooldridge. He did not disappoint.
Pretty good guest too. One of my takeaways was like, obviously there is a vote this fall. If you don't know about it, try and do some research, listen to the show. But like one of the points he got across was like, don't just vote for the party, vote for the person and allow that person to be the voice, in Victoria at a government level.
Yeah.
So it was nice to sit down and get to know him. Funny, like halfway through the show, kind of realized that he's a Boucherie boy. So he was a couple of years ahead of me, but yeah, respect to the West Kelowna side. But yeah, you're right. We do talk a lot about kind of more of the entrepreneurial side and small businesses. And he's a good person to have on because, that's how he cut his teeth in Kelowna, was starting a small business. And then he's slowly worked up the chain on council and regional board and now NDP candidate. So very impressive resume that he carries and really cool guy. Stick around to the end of the show because how he gives back was amazing. It was pretty inspiring.
It was really interesting talking to him about his whole career and then to learn how much of a role he played in Kelowna when all hell broke loose during the fires last year. Like he was part of the regional district, like the director or the chair during all that time, and really an interesting dude. He's seen all these issues from all the sides. Like he was an entrepreneur. Now he's making policy for the city of Kelowna. So he was a great guest to have on. We're really happy that he took the time to talk to us.
Yeah. And I mean, like we said, we talk mostly, I'm speaking for myself, more on the capitalist side on this show, but it's not to say that we don't agree with the social aspects. And he's kind of somebody that blends the two together from our conversation.
Yeah.
Kelowna is an amazing city and it's growing at a very quick rate. So we need to be conscious of both, supporting the capitalist ventures and supporting our social needs here for everyone. So yeah, we just loved having him on the show. He was a good guy. So I think you guys are really going to enjoy this one. And get out and vote. No matter who it's for, just get out there and do some education.
Yeah, we got to bring up the voting. So like he was saying that the municipal turnout is like around 30%, which is just insanely low.
Yeah.
Like, come on, people.
Yeah.
So we got to vote for municipal, but the election in the fall is for provincial, which is higher. We get like 60%, which is pretty high, but could do better. So get out and vote in November. What day is the election?
The polls open middle of October. The final, like once we get the data back, I think it's October 19th that has to be closed out at.
Yeah, so learn about the candidates by listening to shows like this and get out and vote in the fall.
Yeah.
And this show, like every show, is sponsored by Century 21 Assurance Realty, the best brokerage in town by far. My home brokerage, where I've always been, where I'll always be. I love it. The atmosphere is awesome. The agents are awesome. The help is awesome. It's really a place where you can grow your business. So if you're a little bit stalled in this market right now or looking for a change, call Max, call Dean, call me, set up a meeting, and look for the move. Enjoy the show.
Well, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on,
Thank
guys.
you so much. Thank you very much for coming. We appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here.
So we like to start our show with just kind of like connecting to the listener. What's your perfect Friday look like in terms of work, productivity? What gives you energy? And then leading into the weekend, what do you do for fun?
Yeah, I love that you start with Friday. Most people start with Monday, and that's really boring.
That's what sets us apart. Like that.
Well, I've always had a philosophy that if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So I'm pretty regimented in my morning routines, whether it's Monday or it's Friday. It's really for getting myself started with the mindset and physical exercise to be able to get my head around whatever the week has been.
Yeah.
But I think probably my favorite thing about Friday is to always have something to look forward to at the end of the day. That's when I tend to always book my RMT or whatever. But in government, I find that everyone wants to clear their inbox by the end of the day. So I'm just always in the mindset that I know Friday will blow up at some point. And it's usually after 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
Oh, yeah.
So it's just, setting the day up to anticipate those things. So when it does go off the rails, you have a plan.
That's kind of like real estate too. It kind of starts to pick up for the weekend, hey? Especially for Matt.
Yeah, it does. But usually, whenever you're slow, I always tell everyone, book a vacation or a date night, and you get busy in a hurry. So I imagine it's similar to you.
Yeah, I've had real estate deals where, the extension comes in at 4:30 in the afternoon on a Friday or whatever it is. So, of course.
Well, you basically started out in Kelowna as a small business owner. Mm-hmm. Can you kind of talk to us a little bit about that before we dive into like the political side? Yeah.
So I've lived here since 1993. My dad and my mom were both members of the RCMP, and we were transferred out here then when I was quite young. So graduated high school here, started my career here, opened my business when I was 21 years old, which was Loyal Hair, and operated that for 16 years. We started in Glenmore, moved to across from the mall, and then opened a second location downtown on St. Paul Street. And then I exited that business about 3 years ago and sold the commercial real estate just this year. So I left the private sector to join the public sector because of the social challenges that we were seeing downtown. We still continue to. And I really wanted to be involved in the solutions and understanding them from a grassroots level. So that's why I decided to exit the private industry and go into public. So it's been quite the journey.
Yeah. And I guess, top of mind for me, just, forgive Matt and I's ignorance with politics. I'm sure like a lot of Kelowna Canadian people, we just are blinded by it. Mm-hmm. So previous to running for NDP, you were with the Conservative Party.
Not the Conservative Party.
BC United.
I was working with the BC United Party when it was a true coalition party of both federal Liberals and federal Conservatives for many years. That was my home for a while, but it's a party that left me and my values no longer aligned. So last year I decided to leave that party and pursue other options. And working alongside this government for the past 6 years has really shown me how they invest into people and want to do the right thing. And being on council and having an open door to both the premier and different cabinet ministers whenever we've needed something in Kelowna, they've always been there and they've invested here regardless of not having representation or it being a stronghold for the party. And it just shows that that's the right thing to do for people. And so when I left the other party, decided to explore other options and have found my home with the New Democrats.
Nice. So I have to ask, has your change had anything to do with the leadership change, Kevin Falcon, or the BC United or anything?
No, not at all. For me, it's really about values. Whatever organization I'm part of, it really has to connect with me as a person because I could never, as who I am, represent something that I don't fully align with. So it was either I don't run or I find a different home. So it wasn't about the leadership or a name change or the branding. It was really about who aligns best with me. And then most importantly, where I can deliver the best results. Yeah. And frankly, with the other parties right now, I just do not see those results being delivered in short order. And we have some really pressing issues here in Kelowna, and we deserve to have a voice in government.
I guess historically, has NDP really had much power in the Okanagan?
It's been 84 years.
Right. Okay. I was looking it up and I saw. Yeah. So what makes you think that this is the time? Like watching the polls, you obviously feel like you have a pretty good chance.
But... Yeah, there's only one poll that matters, and that's election day. Yeah. And obviously, as we get closer and closer to an election, as always, people are more attuned to the political climate. And so they will be more vocal around where they're leaning heading into the election. So it's always a barometer check to see where folks are sitting. But at the end of the day, for me, it's a strong ground game. I've been doing the work on council. And so whatever party I'd be a part of, I'm going to represent Kelowna to the best of my ability. And I've always been deeply involved in Kelowna, whether that's in the non-for-profit sector, but most importantly, doing the work and really understanding what the complex challenges are we face here in the central Okanagan and in Kelowna proper, and what are the sustainable solutions. There's going to be a lot of political bravado and simple answers to really complex problems. But I can tell you, after doing this work for 6 years, it's not that easy. So anyone that's coming out of the gate and thinking that you're going to wave a magic wand and homelessness is going to go away has another thing coming for them. So that's what I'm really bringing to the table is the amount of work that I've been doing. Hopefully that can win us the election.
It's pretty cool actually to me, to see somebody switch parties because it just shows that you're confident in yourself and what you want to do instead of just trying to go with a party that, you think might win the votes or not. Because as a voter, we're really influenced by you guys, obviously, having conversations with you. And can you walk us through how that looks provincially, I guess? Because we vote locally. How does it kind of work up the ladder?
Well, I think the beauty of Canadian politics in general is that there's the option to vote for the person, not the party. Yeah. And I know myself as a voter, I've voted for almost every party there is based on who would represent locally. And so when I'm talking to folks on the door, it's really, well, if you've never voted for the New Democrats before, trust someone that's going to have your voice in Victoria, not necessarily someone that's just coming out of the woodwork now that there's an election, but that's been doing the work. And so Canadians, I find, are more apt to think that way. And our friends south of the border, very different. You know, you have two parties and you're either one or the other and you don't ever cross. Yeah. I think in Canada and British Columbia, that pulse is a little bit different. Obviously, you're going to get one side that only votes this way and another only votes that way, but folks are open to having that conversation.
Yeah. So I guess if we're aligned with you, but maybe not so much the NDP in terms of provincial, I mean, let's be honest, some of the legislation that's come out recently in the last year has been fairly detrimental if you're in the real estate business or maybe entrepreneurship type of business. So what kind of voice, I guess, are you going to bring to Victoria?
Sure. Yeah. So first and foremost, we need made in Kelowna solutions. Like we have very different community and with different nuances to it. And one of those, and we'll probably dive into it a little bit more, is short-term rentals. I know it's been a hot button issue, but at the City of Kelowna, we really took a leadership role in 2020 at really regulating that industry because we saw the impacts that we were having on the housing market. And a lot of communities hadn't done that yet. So I understand why government came out with a sledgehammer and made a blanket policy and legislation around short-term rentals, because quite frankly, it takes a lot of courage to make those changes. And in 2020, we really took a lot of flack for that. Now, why I say we need made in Kelowna solution is we have certain buildings that have been built with the purpose of being short-term rentals.
That is the biggest issue we hear all the time.
Exactly.
That's the issue.
And so, you know, there's a front desk in the lobby, or that was the purpose of the building. And so with that in mind, that's where a Kelowna voice is really important. Now, I could have just been a barking dog in opposition for the next 4 years saying everything is bad. But what I've learned on council is that when you can work alongside government and find ways to massage policy that can work for your community, that's where everyone can win. Like anyone can pound the table and scream and yell and be theatrical about it. Yeah. But at the end of the day is how can you make it work for Kelowna? And that's really what I'm committed to doing.
Nice. So what was the thinking behind the City of Kelowna? Like the BC government came on with their thing, said no short-term rentals, and the City of Kelowna added on, like...
They made it more strict.
They added on another level, like you can't do the suite or the carriage house. Like what was the thought behind that?
So that discussion I actually wasn't part of, but Kelowna Council did take a stronger view on it. And their position from the start around carriage homes and suites has been... those are really lower priced units for renters. So I understand why they took that position. You know, they could have gone more so along with what government had been recommending, but that's the choice that they decided to make. I will say it has been a real challenge in neighborhoods managing short-term rentals. The amount of complaints that we receive annually is quite significant. Yeah. And up until now, there hasn't really been a detractor from people misbehaving, because as local government, we're constrained to how we can fine folks that aren't aligning with our policies, and the fines are quite low. So people just started to build that into their business model. So when industries are unregulated, unfortunately, there's bad actors that paint everyone with the same brush. So there's a lot of nuance to that file.
So I guess magic wand for you, what would be the solution? Like, what would you like to see happen?
Well, first and foremost, I already mentioned it. I think if you're going to operate commercial business, like if you're to lease a space downtown, for example, you're going to pay a commercial tax rate. The amount of services that commercial businesses use as opposed to residential is quite significant. So if people want to operate at that level, like a mini hotel, then pay a tax rate that the mini hotels would be paying a commercial insurance rate, for example. Yeah. So a lot of people say, well, I bought this, condo as a business. Okay, well then buck up and pay those rates because they're significantly higher and make that work. Yeah. That said, when it comes to the buildings that have been purpose built, I do think that it's where there needs to be more conversation with government. And we've been having those behind the scenes. Again, advocacy isn't done by pounding the table and making government look bad. It's about having constructive conversations. Now, the Minister of Housing has been very strong in his positions on these pieces of legislation. I can't see it changing before the election because there can't be special exceptions made. And politically, I don't think that's sound. So that's honestly what I'd be advocating for, is made in Kelowna solutions when we can look at different buildings that have been built with that purpose.
Yeah, because like buildings like Aqua, Caban, there's fears now about people even being able to close to buy them, right? And like, obviously it puts the end user, like the buyer in a position, but also puts the developer in a position. Like you kind of sold all these things, saying one thing, and then before they're even finished, you get a rule change.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, biasly, like Matt and I are mostly in this echo chamber because we do speak with a lot of developers and real estate investors and people that are in the industry. And we do feel that it's hindering the amount of projects that are starting because maybe developers don't feel the support from a provincial government that they have the ability to build in these profit margins. So I guess in terms of like housing supply, what are the next steps? Like I can't say personally I agree much with much of the legislation that's come out. I understand why, but I mean, I am a little bit more capitalist in the sense where I feel like to build units, we just need to give it to the private sector and let them build.
So where I'd push back a little bit on that, I'm assuming the legislation you're speaking to is just short-term rental legislation.
Yeah.
Right. And so the Housing Supply Act is actually really capitalist driven, because if you look at allowing multi-unit buildings in every residential lot across the city, it's significantly increasing supply.
And it's been taking the NIMBYs out of it.
It's taking out the pushback that we see at public hearings.
I agree with that totally.
So, you know, short-term rentals aside, the Housing Supply Act is really meant to bring housing on faster and to bring as many units on as much as possible. And I can tell you, sitting on council for the last 6 years, every other Tuesday night when we'd sit in public hearings, it'd be about 95% of the people there opposed to housing and 5% there to support it. And generally those that would be there to support it would be a Gen Z or a millennial that has nowhere to live. And so that is the friction that local government feels, is that if they vote in favor of something in front of all those people sitting in the gallery, well, they're going to lose votes in the next municipal election. So we just saw yesterday, council voted down a 6-story building on Glenmore Road because there were opposition letters written in from the neighborhood.
Really?
Yeah. So again, it's those pressures when just up the road, another application the same day, the same zoning, MF3, received approval, which didn't have any negative feedback attached to it. So that's just an indicator of how
quickly the squeaky wheel gets the grease on that. Is that how that works?
And that's the frustrating part around housing supply, is because I'll get a letter that says, well, this apartment building shouldn't be built in a residential neighborhood. And so I read the email and I'm like, but it's residential properties that are being built. They mean single family homes. And I get it. When neighborhoods are changing, it does change the look and feel of a neighborhood, but we have to remember that we have to take action on what is a housing crisis right now. And UBCO has 1,000 students that don't have housing. I'm talking to faculty out there that are professors that can't buy condos. They're in bidding wars here in Kelowna. So we know we need over 2,400 units a year injected into our inventory here in Kelowna, whether that's market or affordable. And so the only way to do that is to really reduce barriers and do that through what the province has done. And I know behind the scenes, other parties were planning to do the same thing. Because they know that you have to get out of the way of developers, and a lot of the local government processes do hinder bringing those online quickly.
I guess from a national point, which obviously this isn't probably in your wheelhouse, I don't know how much like it goes up the food chain, but like bare land trust agreements, that was like a complete flop. I think there was about 44,000 filings, which is obviously pretty costly to everyone. Capital gains inclusion, we're not still sure how that's going to come down. Speculation tax would be one provincially that maybe we could speak about. Like, there just seems like we're swimming upstream a little bit. So maybe on the speculation tax, like, do you have a bit of a position on that?
So I won't talk about the federal policies, because at the end of the day, we don't control the central bank and the geopolitical climates in terms of how international trade works. But when it comes to speculation, it was interesting. I was having a conversation back in December at an event with a realtor that represents a lot of pre-purchase. And he said, oh man, since the short-term rental legislation started talking about it, my pre-sales for studios and 1-bedrooms have completely fallen off the map for these pre-sales. And we need those for the development to get off the ground. I thought, well, interesting, because our housing needs assessment for people to live in homes is showing the biggest deficit are 1-bedrooms and studios. So we've just been like pounding out those applications. And I've been the one to always speak about the need for this housing. But what's come to light is that our housing needs assessment data has actually been skewed, because those purchases weren't necessarily for housing need of people to live in them, but they were for investment. And so the real concern for me comes in that you have these Gen Zs and millennials that are wanting to get into the market, don't necessarily want to live in a studio or 1-bed. But those projects are being financed with those products because they're being sold the fastest.
So the data is skewed because investors were buying so many. So we start producing more of them, and that's not what the end user wants. Well, I guess, what does the end user want then? Obviously, everyone wants like a single family home that's affordable.
I think people just want a home in general. The one beds I still believe are relevant, and part of what we've struggled with on council around the studios is, do we limit the amount of those units because they're smaller and they're like little mini hotel rooms, or do we give the people the option to buy them if they don't want them? So what we've been trying to do is work with the development community to have a less percent in the buildings to see what the uptick is. And the development community has been very amiable to do that and really bringing more one bedrooms online. So the changes to the speculation tax, more so the flipping tax here in British Columbia, is really meant to limit those people that are buying paper and then turning around and selling them for a $50,000 profit. And frankly, I find it really stifling because those people are holding product just to turn around and sell the paper. And whenever it closes, make that kind of money, and it's just being tacked on to the end user. So I understand why the government's doing that.
But hold on. So isn't that those people, they inject money into the developers, which they need to finish the projects, which lets them build more projects in the future? So like those properties, the values are going up, but is it the fault of the people just buying them and then selling them later? Or is it we just need the demand?
So what I would say is they're selling them later for an increased value, even though they haven't been lived in.
Yeah, but those people are the people originally putting their deposits in and financing the developer. So they're basically financing the developer to get the project off the road. And then when the end user comes and buys it off them, yes, it's higher. Is it because of them, or are they riding a wave that's going to happen anyway? You know, but the benefit,
it's like we should tell the bank to lend interest-free money to build those, because
basically,
somebody's got to make a profit down that. And there are some potential scenarios where like people don't make so much money. I agree with you. Maybe 15 years ago when people were putting like 5% down and making a very large margin. But now with most developments, I mean, we're 10% with basically a deposit on time of signing, and usually like another 5% and 5%. Like you're into it for 20% on a $400,000 condo. People are really putting their money out there. And yeah, I agree with Matt. I think it's the only way to really get these projects off the ground. I guess what's the alternative solution to that?
Right. So again, if folks are buying them for themselves, that's not an issue.
Yeah.
And if you want to hold it for 2 years and then turn around and sell it for a profit, you can still go ahead and do that. You just have to hold that product for 2 years and close on it. So that's still an option. What government is doing is partnering with the development community through the new BC Builds program. And what they're doing is offering lower interest financing so that those projects can get off the ground. What we're doing in the City of Kelowna through our Housing Accelerator Fund through the federal government is acquiring the land so that the City of Kelowna can still own them and partner with different developers that will build the building, and then nonprofits will operate it. And that's more of the below market housing strategy. But government realizes that they need to also step up and help fund developers even for market housing. And so that's the new BC Builds program that has just come out, because again, financing, we know that that's a barrier, and government does have to come to the table with that.
Can you talk a bit about the Accelerator Fund? Like super interested in that. Essentially, you guys got this grant, or Kelowna got this grant.
I wish I got it personally. It's $30 million.
Yeah. Was it like 5 months ago? When did it?
So it was really cold. I remember that. So it was definitely the winter.
That was January 12th, I think.
It was winter time. I remember I was really, really cold.
As soon as all the vines died, like you guys need some.
So we were one of, if not the first community in British Columbia to receive this grant from the federal government, because basically, in the words of Sean Fraser, the federal minister, he said, I'm going to push on the door that's open. And when they looked at all of our housing policies in the City of Kelowna, they saw how progressive they were and how we have removed as many barriers as we could as a municipality. Federal government's role is to get as many homes built as quickly as possible. So they're looking to municipalities that can do that. So we were basically given just over $30 million to basically dole out as we need to. They didn't put too many restrictions on it. Other municipalities are getting restrictions, like you must do this with that money. Because we have so many different housing initiatives within the City of Kelowna, whether that's our Housing Reserve Fund or it's our DCC grant program, they said, okay, you guys work on a plan, you work with a planner, tell us how you're doing it. We obviously have reporting standards and agreements that we have to report out on, but it'll be used for just yesterday. We've bolstered $3 million to our DCC relief program. So that's the development cost charges that developers are having to pay per unit. So this will be used to offset those for projects that are making an effort to deliver more affordable housing. We are using it to acquire land. So the City of Kelowna acquired land on Glenmore Road. That was the application that I spoke about yesterday that we rezoned. And by holding the land, it's future equity for the future residents of Kelowna. I'm a huge proponent of the city owning as much residential land as we can, because then we control how it can be used for future generations. And so with that model, we've created a developers framework that basically will be going out to RFP to see what developers are interested to partner with government to build the homes, with up to 20% needing to be affordable, which is the Housing Accelerator Fund's requirement. So they're still able to do market with it, but 20% have to be affordable, which is it under 20 or 30% of median income?
Yeah. That's awesome. I do agree. Like, I think Kelowna's doing such a fantastic job at holding land, developing land, park space. So yeah, kudos to you guys. And like you said, like, it is very innovative, like the technology you guys have and the speed you're progressing in the planning department. Yeah, so you guys are doing a lot of good things, and glad it's being recognized at a provincial, federal level.
As a realtor, I work all over the Okanagan thing. Vernon, Penticton, and beyond. And Kelowna is by far the easiest to work with. It's actually not even close. So it's been awesome. Yeah.
I guess, what does Kelowna look like in the next 10, 15 years in terms of where you would like to see it? Not just in housing, but just like where we go as a culture.
Well, we're really at a turning point as a city, because I think, like with business, I always have the philosophy that managing an uptick in business is equally as challenging as handling a downturn, because you can grow too rapidly too quickly, and there's implications with that, or there can be a downturn and there's implications with that. And with a bigger city come bigger city problems. And we're seeing that with the social challenges here in Kelowna, which I mentioned earlier. And so we just have to be really cognizant of how we're planning the city. And so that's with the new official community plan. You're seeing a real focus to build out the urban centers with more density. And that's done very strategically around the infrastructure that's needed to service those areas, because we cannot just keep building out into the hillsides and incurring additional taxation costs for snow removal, maintenance, bus service, name it. The service demand doesn't diminish depending where the housing is. So there's some shifts in how we're growing the city, and people will debate if those are appropriate policies or not. But basically 80% of our development right now are in our urban centers, and 20% is in the outlying areas currently. And again, that's to really maximize how we can build out our infrastructure, which is, we have quite a deficit.
Yeah. I mean, I guess, is it supposed to just support the local community here, or are you trying to build it out so more of a tourist city? Because I feel like, in the last 12 months, obviously, like circle back too much with short-term rental, but maybe like a lot of the small businesses that are kind of built on tourism are penalized a bit. Like, it's really difficult to have that fine balance, I guess, to make it an affordable city or not. Ryan Smith, when he was on, actually coined a pretty good comment. It was like, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. Like, we're our own worst enemy, because we're making this beautiful city that people want to flood to, but then we can't really make it affordable. So I guess, what are the priorities? Is it homelessness? Anything else that you're kind of passionate about that? Like, what's number one on the list?
Oh gosh, it would be hard to pick one thing. And when I meet with different interest groups throughout Kelowna, everyone has kind of their number one thing. And the thing about this job is they overlap like a Venn diagram so much that we have to create priorities that are quite broad. Obviously, we've talked a lot about housing. Will Kelowna be a super, super affordable town? I don't think we will get there. Like, we have to keep supporting our most vulnerable and keep building housing. But having apartments that are $800 a month, I think, would be challenging for any new stock. We've heard from the development community, development today is the most costly it's ever been. So it's a reality that we have to struggle with. And obviously, we can't build a wall and stop people from moving here. It's a beautiful place to live.
I know a politician that can't pay that.
So, you build a world-class city. Yeah. But what's an interesting paradigm shift right now, we heard from Andrew Ramlow with Rennie earlier this year, is the Gen Z and millennial populations are going to have a demographic paradigm shift here in the next 10 years, and they're going to be outweighing the baby boomers in terms of their demand. And so what we really have to focus on economically here in the Okanagan are attracting those high-paying jobs so that those folks can afford to stay here and live here. We've got world-class education, but I hear time and time again that people graduate from UBCO or Okanagan College and they leave town and go to another province because they can't afford to buy a home here. And so as a city, we're continually looking at what are our economic opportunities. We have seen a huge success with the largest employer in Kelowna Flightcraft, KF. Yeah. And so we are always looking at like, how can we attract more investment to Kelowna? We do have a confidential interest from another company that would bring another 150 really high paying jobs, 6-figure salaries here if we can attract them. So there is a real opportunity for the Okanagan to be attracting higher paying jobs, because back to your point around tourism, aside from short-term rentals, where I'm really, really concerned is climate change. And we've seen that now with our ski hills, and we've seen that with our wineries. And those are two of the biggest draws for two different seasons.
The orchards, it feels like every almost season, the orchards and the wineries or the vineyards are finding there's some weather event that's different than the last one. It just keeps on coming. It keeps piling on.
Yeah. And farmers are resilient and they're used to weather being different. But what's changed is the intensity and how quickly it changes. So that's what I've heard from farmers is, we can be prepared for this. But if all of a sudden a cold snap comes tomorrow and it's the beginning of October, that's not something we're used to. So I think climate impacts are going to continue to be a concern economically here, because we are so driven by our tourism industry, which is most of the natural environment. So when we're looking to attract new investment, I do think we have to be diverse in what we're offering.
Yeah. And you were very involved with the fires last year, right? Like you were coordinating where people went once they potentially lost their house. So you're on the regional district, or you were, sorry.
Yeah.
Can you just walk us through the position there and how you've transitioned, I guess?
Sure. So all municipalities in British Columbia are part of regional districts, which are unique to this province. Nowhere else in Canada has this model of basically being a cohort of municipalities that come together to pool their resources to offer services to their residents. And part of that program is the Emergency Operations Center. And the reason for that is it's an overlapping jurisdiction. So all the partner municipalities and First Nation contribute towards that function, so that when there is an event like what we saw last year with the McDougall Creek wildfire, we're resourced appropriately to do that. So I'm an appointee from the City of Kelowna to that board, and I've been the chair of that board for the past 3 years. I just recently stepped down as chair because of my provincial run, just so that I'm not leveraging that position for personal benefit. But I led the communications through that fire last year. It was interesting because I was having a small barbecue at my house when the fire started. The Minister of Emergency Management phoned me, Bo and Ma, and she's like, so we're getting indications about this fire. And we had about an hour-long conversation. And my friends that were over like, should we go home? Like, it's not going to jump the lake, right? I'm like, oh, it never jumps the lake. You'll be fine. So again, the intensity that we saw with that fire, I was speaking to some of our fire chiefs, and they said, on the front line, we've never seen a fire turn into a tornado. The winds picked up, it turned into a tornado, it ripped a pine tree out by the roots and had it swirling around in this tornado of fire. And so that just speaks to the level of intensity that we're now seeing in these annual events. We're no longer calling it fire season. We're calling it hazard season, because it starts in June with floods, and then it progresses through heat domes, wildfires, and then into recovery. So that's where I'm personally really concerned about climate change and the impacts that it's going to have here locally moving forward.
Yeah. Well, it seems like you wear a lot of hats. We should have started with this, but how'd you get into politics? Really, you went from small business owner to, You
know what I love about business and I love about being an entrepreneur and business owner is that you have to be a problem solver, because you never know what's going to fly at you today. People are like, oh, you're a hairdresser and you're now a politician. And I'm like, well, I was a business owner, because you never know when a pipe's going to break or, something's going to flood or all your staff are going to quit or what have you. And so it gives you a different insight to be nimble and to adjust. And, you can't understate the professional staff that work in these organizations. As elected officials, we're very privileged to work alongside some really brilliant people that provide us with expert advice. It's our job to obviously represent the voices of the people that elect us and to hold government accountable. But I found it really interesting to understand the city from 360, because it's really easy to sit back and say, oh, I would have engineered that light system differently, or I would have built that park differently. But it's really cool to see the city from 360 and all of the nuances where this all has to work together. Because again, it's not just one single priority. Everything is an ecosystem in a city. So that's probably what I find the most interesting. But being a small business owner and entrepreneur really helped me understand that from a diverse perspective.
Yeah.
Hey, Loyal, I just want to circle back to housing for a second.
Surprise, surprise.
Kelowna Real Estate Podcast.
What is the goal, with yours or the NDP? Is the goal with the real estate prices to lower the prices, or is it to flatline them, or just slow the rate at what they're growing? What is the goal? What are all these policies geared towards?
So quite simply is to build more homes faster.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have come at me about, well, if I put my Airbnb on the rental market, it's not going to be affordable. Probably not. But what we're looking for are to bring more homes online for people to live in faster. If we hit a vacancy rate that's more than over 1%, that conversation can change. Like, to underscore, the short-term rental legislation only affects municipalities that have a vacancy rate less than 3%. So since I joined council, my goal has been to see it over 3% in terms of vacancy. Yeah. And we've never gotten there. And we've seen the past 5 years with the highest building values in Kelowna's history, cresting over $1 billion. Yeah. So it's disheartening for me to have run in 2018 to think that we're going to raise that vacancy rate. And I think the last stat I saw was just over 1%. So it's really to see that above 3%. West Kelowna was able to opt out of that legislation because they were able to demonstrate the 3%. I have my own thoughts on that. Well, go ahead. That's our main goal, is to see that vacancy rate raise. I don't want to hear about students sleeping in their cars or being evicted from their homes. But that would be the goal, is building more homes faster.
I always think about this, like lowering the prices is basically, I feel like when you're adding just endless rental properties, like purpose-built rentals and stuff like that, you feel like the goal should be to get more renters to be homeowners, right? Like basically renters into owners. And I feel like buying purpose-built rentals, does that really check that box in that?
So it's a real North American mindset that everyone has to be an owner. If you speak to folks in Europe and the UK, many folks choose to rent their whole lives. Yeah. And so, while I'm a homeowner and I've been able to realize that, I realize that not every person is going to have the capital to necessarily purchase a home. And that's the incentive of rental tenure only. What's interesting is these REITs that have been buying at purpose-built rental buildings actually aren't interested in buying them anymore. And so they're now approaching government to say, hey, do you want to buy this purpose-built rental building? And government has been absent in the housing market for decades, since the 90s, which this has just been building to that point. If there had been proactive approaches up until now to have publicly funded housing for folks that need it, I would argue that we probably wouldn't be in the state that we're in. This has just been building and building and building. And as I spoke to earlier, with the demographic that is now going to eclipse the baby boomers that can't afford housing, we have to get them into something first. So that is why there's such a focus on rental tenure. And it's also more of an inventory that can be controlled in terms of not who's living there, but what rates are being charged and how governments can incentivize it.
I mean, well, I was going to say not to put you on the spot, but I'll put you on the spot a little bit. Do you know how many units, and you can kind of be vague, but like purpose-built rentals in the next 2 or 3 years? Because it seems like everywhere I drive, and I've had a few coffee meetings with some very large developers who are building these, like 2,500, 3,000, like there seems like an abundant amount coming on the market. I mean, obviously Kelowna is planning, but like how involved are you when you're permitting these, saying, okay, guys, like enough's enough? Or are you just watching the vacancy rate being like, just open the floodgates and just keep building?
Well, back to your capitalist comment earlier, the market is really going to decide what kind of inventory is being built.
I was going to say it because if right now it's harder to sell them.
And we just heard from Ryan Smith yesterday with our Q1 development results is that over the next 2 years, we're likely to see a higher investment into purpose-built rental because the performers are just performing better than the condo market. And it's more of a guaranteed income for the developer because they know that they can rent those units for X amount. They know the vacancy is this, and they know what their financing can be. And then there's also stacked incentives that we offer with the city for density and parking reductions, et cetera, that they can use for that purpose. So we are tracking it. We have quite an amazing and award-winning software system that our IS department has developed in order to be tracking these barometers. But again, the market is really going to speak to us and tell us what they're needing. Andrew Ramelow spoke earlier this year that British Columbia needs to build about 900,000 homes in the next 20 years. And so with that, the sector doesn't even have capacity.
Like I was going to say, is that even like possible?
Like the sector doesn't even have workers to be building that amount of units. Yeah. So that's our forecast based on population. And so there has to be bold moves for urgent action in order to be making housing more available moving forward. So we are tracking it. And I know it's been argued around the table, are we building too much rental? And I'm always saying, no, we can never build enough. But I think the development community will speak to us if it starts to tip the other direction.
Yeah. I mean, it doesn't seem like you're a guy to point the finger and blame people. Obviously, we could look back and say, hindsight 10 years ago, wow, we should have started to build more. But, we've spoken about this on the show before. There's been like a massive influx of population growth in Canada. So Yeah, I guess it doesn't sound like you're in that position where you're saying there was an error 10, 15 years ago. It's like, hey, let's deal with the current issue.
Don't get me wrong. I think there was definitely an error over the past 2 decades. And I think it's touched every single political party that has governed. So I'm not going to point at one single leader or one single party. It was an exit from government in the housing industry and just left it to the private sector. And, you know, they're business people. They're going to make money how they need to in their business model. And so I don't blame anyone for it. But I think it's just important that we understand how we got here, because it didn't just happen overnight. This has just been a slow boil over time that's led to this point. And it's the same as mental health and substance use with services that haven't been built over the past 20 to 30 years. So government has had to now enter that realm again and start investing into government funded housing. And then over time, it's going to take time. We didn't get here in 7 years. It's been decades. We will start to realize those results. And it's the same with this housing legislation. I've heard from developers that are actually really singing the praises about it because it's getting government out of the way so that they can do their jobs to build homes. Because again, they're investors and they want a guaranteed outcome if they're coming forward with an application that is compliant with official community plan. And if they're playing Russian roulette with different elected officials, depending on the sentiment of a neighborhood, it becomes very difficult to invest $1 million into planning when they don't know the outcome.
Yeah, I think a lot of the policies are going to be super popular and also adopted probably right across the country. Even the short-term rentals, I think, is probably going to be some kind of policy right across, much to Taylor and all listeners.
Well, I think with any legislation, it has to be realized that this isn't like written in stone. It's not the 10 Commandments. Legislation changes over time and it adapts based on what's needed in public. And again, this is in response to that urgent need. And the premier had, he was elected premier about 18 months before this next election. And so the government does need to make urgent changes to realize positive results in communities.
Nice.
All right. So Loyal, over the pandemic, we had this crazy spike in immigration. And I talked about this before on the show, but Taylor and I can't figure out, was there a lobbyist group or is there some people asking for this level of immigration? We just can't figure out why it spiked so high and the way it did. It just didn't really make any sense.
So I'm not in the federal government's head. I did attend a luncheon earlier this year and they were asking that of the immigration minister, how did this happen? What are the targets? And they basically didn't have an answer. And that's concerning because, again, like we spoke about earlier, all of these policies really have to work in tandem. So if you're inviting a certain amount of folks into our country, you need to make sure that they're being accommodated with housing. And we've seen the city of Toronto, for example, starting to push back and saying, okay, well, federal government, you've invited all these people to our city that are now living on the street with nowhere to go. We're going to create a Canada tax locally to pay for the housing that we need to house these people. So that's why it's so important for these policies to really align. And I think some people say, oh, if you're questioning immigration, you're being racist. And I don't think that that's the point. It's just simply numbers. It's to say, if you're inviting these folks in, we need to make sure that they're taken care of. We need to make sure that we have the services to support them and that we're planning for them to be able to get around, for example. And I know that there's been a lobby out of Vancouver with TransLink that needs additional funding because they've seen their ridership increase so much because of new residents moving there. So that's why it's so important to have a collaborative relationship and ensure that the policies are aligning.
It just seems with the immigration, it got so high and nobody can figure out why. Not even the federal government. They're just well, this kind of got out of hand now, didn't it? Now we're going to put some limits on it. It was what? Everyone saw there was a slow moving train coming. And now that you have spiked housing prices, everyone's mortgages are high. And then you have raised interest rates. And then you look back and think, why did we get here? And all the fingers well, we had such high immigration. It's well, why did we have immigration? No one seems to know. So it's kind of funny.
And there have been benefits with immigration. We know we need workers. We know that we need folks in those jobs. But again, that's why it's so important to be doing this planning, to be okay, if these people are coming here, where are they going to live? Where are they going to go to school? Where are they going to go get healthcare? Which is a whole other podcast that we could do is on health. But
that's the Kelowna healthcare podcast.
So again, when you asked earlier, what's the number one priority or what's the city going to do about one certain thing? It's hard to identify that because everything is so interconnected. Again, it's an ecosystem, and that's the purpose of government, is to serve as best we can.
I mean, I know the answer. You must love your job and get a lot of energy from it, but it must be pretty overwhelming as well, constantly being in these planning meetings when everything right now seems kind of doomsday. It's great, we live in this amazing place, but at the end of the day, the problems you guys are facing do they just seem achievable? Like, do you guys feel pretty confident moving forward?
I have to say that no one gets into this work for the paycheck or because you're really self-interested for your own self-benefit. It's truly community service, and it's an honor to serve when we can. So it is disheartening when you're, proactively working on policies and housing and all of this, and it seems to be getting worse. But we have to realize that it takes time for those results to be realized. But it's really staying focused at that 30,000 foot level of where we want to go as a city and making sure that we have the right people on the bus to steer us in that direction, ensuring that all of the different aspects are being considered when we're pulling one lever, because it always has another effect. So it can be disheartening, especially around homelessness and crime and safety, for example, because it sometimes doesn't feel like you're moving the barometer, but then you'll see little glimmers of results that are actually positive. And so you just have to stay focused on those and committed to the work. But that's the thing I love about local government, is that you really learn it from the ground up and from a grassroots level.
Yeah. Awesome.
Now we just need to get more people to vote.
Yeah, like 30% is quite low. 60% provincially is much better.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting that folks don't necessarily...
This is a drum I beat all the time. I don't understand why. Like, you don't vote in the election, but then the projects come up and you're there with a picket. It's just crazy, like...
Basically, the election's going to be complete October 19th. Is
exactly,
that... So, yeah, get ready.
Get out there and vote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I might need another job, so it all depends how that goes.
No, you got it. I think you got it. So...
Okay, well, we're going to go into our wrap-up questions here.
Cool.
If you could buy one property in Okanagan in the next 12 months, what would it be?
Oh, man, I'm so comfortable where I live with my husband, Ian, right now. I can't see myself buying another property in 12 months. I think my dream would be a recreation property, but that wouldn't hit that 12-month window. But it's hard to get away from my device, so I do appreciate when I can get out into the woods to a recreation property. So that would probably be the ultimate goal.
Nice.
If you could give your 20-year-old self one piece of advice, what would it be?
I think it would be to normalize mental health care and maintenance. I never really realized what a journey mental health is. And I lost my mom unexpectedly in 2016, and I went through some real dark times around that.
Yeah.
But it also is what propelled me into local government, because I realized if there's something you want to do, you need to do it, because the future isn't promised. But I would really stress to my younger self that to really prioritize mental health care, and it's more of a journey than a destination, because I think we all ebb and flow with it depending on our circumstance, but it's really important for...
Can you say that? You're talking about like your personal, like as in take care of yourself personally, your mental health?
Correct. Yeah.
I agree with that. I agree with that all the time. Like when I'm mentoring new agents or anything like that, I kind of give advice to talk about like, it's stressful, right? When you're doing this job, I'm sure doing, obviously every job has its own, but like your mental health is the only thing you really have. So like you have to really take care of it. So I completely agree with that. And everyone has their own story, right? So
yeah. Actually, through the campaign, I've hired a sports psychologist over the next 6 months to work with. And I'm not really a sporty person, but when I analyzed kind of the resilience coaching that I needed, I landed with sports psychology, because it's like leading up to that one event. And so I find mental health very interesting. And again, it's part of that journey. So
cool. Yeah. I mean, there must be a lot of noise in day-to-day life, and you got to have thick skin. Like Matt and I have a hard enough time just recording a podcast. I can imagine being a public figure like you. So, okay, what is your favorite charity, or how do you give back?
So I always use my business as a way to be giving back to the community with different initiatives. And I would say my themes are women, families, animals, and health. Those are kind of the categories that I personally like to support. And that's where I donate and volunteer my time. And actually, when my mom passed away, I was the executive of her estate. And because she was so young, she hadn't done a lot of financial planning to pass away. Like she'd done financial planning, but she was young, so it wasn't structured in a way for her to die so quickly, unfortunately. And so with that came some huge tax implications. So my sister and I actually took a portion of her capital and put it into a legacy charity giving foundation. And that generates interest every single year, which we then donate to charities. And so it's been our way of not only doing tax planning on her behalf, so that we weren't just paying CRA a couple $100,000, but our way of being able to give back to the community. So I donate to that charity, and then I donate that money back to different charities every year.
That is incredible.
That is incredible.
I mean, obviously a very difficult time in life to come up with such an amazing idea. Did you do some estate planning with lawyers and that's how it kind of came up, or did you just kind of come up with this
well, I was working with an accountant and I was like, okay, like what are the ways that we could save taxation? He said, well, you could donate. And I'm like, okay. And then I talked to my financial advisor, like, well, did you know about charitable giving and how you can set up a foundation in a loved one's name? And I didn't. And it's very inexpensive to do. And there's like a minimum of $20,000. So I tell everyone about it because some people don't have kids, and it's a great way to do some estate planning and also have a legacy alive, so that every year, like when I think of my mom in December, I get to choose charities that she would like and support them. So we usually choose more of like startup grassroots charities because we know how hard it is to raise capital. So every year it's a bit different.
Yeah, that's awesome.
That is actually a really good idea. So
Thanks.
Glad you brought that one up. All right, Loyal, how can myself or Taylor or our listener help you?
So I would say follow my social channels. That's where I'm going to be talking about me and everything Kelowna and what matters, which is Loyal Kelowna on Instagram, Facebook, and the lovely realm of Twitter, well, X, formerly known as Twitter.
I'm still calling it.
That's where I'll be sharing a lot about myself and what I'm bringing to the table. Obviously, you'll hear about policy statements from the party later on, but just really speaking about what I stand for, what I'm advocating for, just getting the word out that it's really about voting for the person who can best represent Kelowna in the legislature and government.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for putting me in the hot seat. Yeah, I knew it would be some difficult questions, so thanks for having me in today.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Much.